right, well, welcome once again, Marina, to ACLU on the Hill. This is our 4th episode, a little bit over the halfway point right now, I believe.
Yeah, it feels good.
All right, and we're
The end is
testing
in
out
sight.
some new wireless mics, so we can do this recording anywhere in the Capitol, which sometimes we have to do to track you down because you're everywhere up here.
It's hard to find a quiet corner.
So this week we'd like to talk about a bill that we support, a bill that we're neutral on, and a bill that we oppose.
Yep.
So let's start with one that we support, and that would be HB 318, which is Representative Stephanie Pitcher's bill coming up in committee next week. And it has to do with inmate shackling or restriction during labor and delivery, something that a lot of people didn't realize was even an issue until she brought this up. Can you tell us about this bill and our position on it?
Yeah, so it is sort of surprising to imagine that in today's world, we might need to pass legislation to say that when a woman is actively in delivery and actively in labor and delivering a baby, if she's incarcerated, that nonetheless she shouldn't be shackled, not only for her own health, but also for the health of the baby that she's about to deliver. But that is the case. There are 19 different states already that have passed legislation along these lines, so Utah certainly wouldn't be the first. But makes sense for us to weigh in at this point because we have heard stories about this happening for inmates who are incarcerated in Utah's jails and in Utah's prison. It's also sort of timely because you may know that Utah's own Mike Lee just sort of was the main sponsor of the First Step Act, which is a massive piece of legislation at the federal level dealing with all sorts of criminal reform issues. And one of the important points of that bill actually was to say that shackling of pregnant inmates is not allowed. That's for federal inmates, of course, so there's still a need to pass legislation here at the state level in Utah.
And in the course of putting this bill together, I believe that the sponsor, Representative Pitcher, and others reached out to physicians, people involved in labor and delivery here in Utah to find out if this had been going on. And there were some stories that this has happened, and even some really sort of crazy stories about someone needing to go to like a crash C-section and not being able to locate the officer or the key and things like that. Is that correct?
That's right. So we will hear some of those stories, I believe, on Monday when this bill is heard in committee. And I think it's really important to bring those stories up to paint the picture for legislators that this legislation is actually needed. So the bill will be brought before the Judiciary Committee on Monday, and hopefully it will be well received by legislators and be able to advance through the legislative session.
Okay, and again, that's HB 318 from Representative Stephanie Pitcher, a new legislator this year.
That's right.
Someone that we know well at the ACLU, which is great.
Yeah.
So let's move on now to the bill that we're neutral on. And this is a very, very big bill this week. It has to do with hate crimes. It's SB 103. Senator Daniel Thatcher really was pushing to bring this bill to consideration this session. Finally got it approved by the caucus, the Senate caucus, to do that, and it had a committee hearing, I believe, this morning.
Yes.
Can you tell us what happened and what the ACLU's rather nuanced position is on this bill?
Yeah, so at the ACLU, sometimes things are complicated, and that's our answer to our position on hate crimes legislation here in Utah, is that it's complex and it's difficult. This bill has been introduced, I think, 4 years in a row now, and this is the first year we've really seen some traction. The ACLU generally has concerns around legislation when we're talking about enhancement and enhanced criminal penalties. There are also some First Amendment concerns when we're talking about trying to figure out what somebody's motive was and whether their beliefs or their speech somehow indicates that their crime was motivated by bias or hate. So these are just sort of some of the background concerns that the ACLU has about hate crimes in general. One of the things that gave us some comfort about this legislation is that it is accompanied by a rule of evidence as well, which was also heard in committee this morning, which makes clear that the evidence that is used to support that a hate crime was committed has to be very narrowly tailored and closely related to the incident at hand. And the point of that rule of evidence really is to make sure that when a prosecutor is thinking about charging a crime as a hate crime, that they can't look back 40 years, for example, into your past and try to go fishing for some little tidbit that they can find to use to explain that your crime wasn't just a simple crime, but should be enhanced because you had some sort of bias that motivated that crime.
So that's really looking at those free speech protections that the ACLU is concerned about, right? Making
That's
sure
right.
that there's not a phishing expedition into people's social media history and things like that.
That's exactly right. So both bills were heard in committee this morning. There's a lot of very emotional and compelling testimony on both sides of the issue, to be frank. The ACLU, after much soul searching on this issue and because of our concerns around mass incarceration in general and the overuse of the criminal justice system, decided to take a neutral stance on this bill. We're not opposing the bill in light of the evidentiary provision that went along with the bill, because we think that does help ease some constitutional concerns. But at the same time, we're also not sort of the prime support or cheerleader for this bill moving forward either.
And we actually have a blog post on the ACLU Utah website, which is about 1,000 words we put together explaining this in great detail, and 5 concerns we have, including the ones that you just described. So if you go to acluutah.org, you can read that blog post. It's right prominent on our website right now.
Yeah, you got to love the ACLU. It takes 1,000 words to explain our position.
Yep, sometimes we're a little verbose. Well, now we'll move to the third bill that we'll discuss today, and that is a bill we oppose. That is HB 136, which is now the 18-week, used to be the 15-week, but now 18-week abortion bill.
Yeah.
That was heard in committee Wednesday morning this week. I believe you spoke against that bill. Can you describe some of the ACLU's concerns with this kind of restrictions on reproductive rights here in Utah?
Yeah, so the bill purports to place a ban on any abortion sought post 18 weeks in a woman's pregnancy, and 18 weeks falls before viability, and the Supreme Court has said very clearly, almost 50 years ago now at this point, that it is unconstitutional for a state to place a restriction in the way of a woman seeking an abortion pre-viability. So on its face, an 18-week ban is unconstitutional. In fact, interestingly, here in Utah in the 90s, the legislature tried passing a 20-week ban. That case was challenged. It was brought before the courts, and the 10th Circuit struck down that provision on precisely these same grounds, that it was unconstitutional under Roe v. Wade, and Roe v. Wade has not changed since that case was decided before the 10th Circuit. And so it is our position that this bill is still unconstitutional, and that the courts will find it so.
Whether it's 15 weeks or 18 weeks, it still falls within the purview of Roe v. Wade. We see that as unconstitutional. What would be the ACLU's course of action if this bill were to become law? What would you think we would do? Would we consider all options?
I think we would absolutely consider all options. I think this is unquestionably a bill that invites litigation, and the question really will be who decides to bring that case.
Got it. Okay. Are there any things going forward that you think our viewers should watch out for? We've got a couple weeks left. Can people still introduce bills that haven't appeared yet? Are we still within that window?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we're already almost to the 5th week, so we're nearing the end of the session, but there are a lot of bills still waiting to come out. There are still bills that are in the hands of the drafters that have not been numbered. There are still bills that have not made it into committee. And there are many bills that are on the board as well, being debated on both the House floor and the Senate floor. So there's still a lot of action to happen, even though the time is short. What I think that means for viewers is that if you're watching from home, you might want to settle in the evenings, because I think the nights are going to get longer and longer as lawmakers try and pack more and more into the limited time that they have left.
That's right, only until about the middle of March or
right.
so. And still quite a few on voting rights, initiatives, and criminal justice still to come.
That's right.
We'll be focused on that. We appreciate your eyes and ears here on the Hill. Thanks for joining us, and we'll check in with you next week.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.